The night smelled of overripe figs and the iron breath of the river, and Mavis Caldera learned to listen to the dark the way a seamstress reads silk. She crouched beside the bleaching logs by the Darrow smokehouse, hands cold from the pump, and counted the slow shiver of leaves as if they were syllables in a sentence only she understood. She knew which owls nested in the sycamores by the bend, which boards on the back porch complained like tired men, and which padlock on the corncrib could be teased open with a bent nail and a prayer. She knew these things because survival was a lesson the night taught without asking permission. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. On the Darrow place, names were a sort of currency spent by other people, but Mavis owned hers in secret. She kept it folded under her tongue when Mistress Eliza called her "Girl, were you there?" and she unfolded it every time she read the river, Mavis, which in her mind meant flint promised to spark. There were other names kept as tightly as her breath, the letters she had taught herself by candle stubs and soot pencils, stitched into the hems of aprons and the margins of flour sacks. She hoarded them the way a bee hides sweetness in the comb's dark rooms. She had learned them from labels on molasses barrels, from prayer book scraps discarded by the parlor, from the arithmetic of seed tallies when Mr. Darrow turned his back. Letters were smaller than the lash and quieter than the bell, yet they were a map that no one could take from her hands, because her hands were always moving. By daylight she was Mavis who scrubbed and Mavis who stirred. In the kitchen she moved like an era of quiet weather the family never bothered to notice, steady, precise, untiring. She could carve a hen to make it feed 2 more mouths than any cook before her. She could heat the brick oven so a loaf breathed out at dawn like a small forgiveness. Those were the crafts that framed her days. Her nights, though, were shaped by another craft entirely. Under the floorboards, beneath the long grain table where the Darrows sun their elbows, she kept a small trove, a spokeshave left behind by a traveling wheelwright, a cracked compass whose needle still knew north, a file worn thin as a whisper. Wood and iron understood Mavis. She could quiet a rattling hinge without drawing the eyes of the house. She could weight a door so that it perceived her as a breeze. It began, that year, with river sickness and corn gone mean. The summer had been a long boil, the fields shimmering until even the scarecrows seemed to melt and drift. Crows learned to cry at night. One morning the house woke to the sound of retching beyond the camellias, and 2 of the boys who worked the lower cotton rows staggered away from the pump as if stabbed by invisible thorns. Mr. Darrow said it was simple heat, that the wheat cooked from the inside if they didn't know their place. Mistress Eliza crossed herself whenever he said it, which was almost but not quite a prayer. Then the pigs started fattening on less feed than usual, and the smokehouse took on a sweetness that didn't belong to smoke. Nobody spoke of it directly, though Mavis heard what wasn't said, which is how a body survives long enough to say anything at all. The Darrows had always been a family that curated what they believed should exist, and what they believed should exist had the same shape as their hunger. They were 5 in the big house now, Mr. Garrett Darrow, who wore his boots like a uniform and his liquor like a library, Mistress Eliza, whose pearls seemed to tighten around her throat as the years wore on, their son, Phineas, with a cupid mouth that gave nothing kindly, cousin Saul, who had arrived 2 winters ago with a hymn book and never quite left, and old Miss Geneva, Garrett's aunt, whose eyes were film slick but found the soft meat of fear like a dog finds a bone. They had been more, former years. Mavis remembered crib laughter and seed corn hair, yet the family shrank as if the land had learned to digest its own names. When the Darrows wore black, they didn't wear sorrow. They wore the idea that the world owed them a replacement. Stories traveled the way fog moves, slow, patient, determined to touch the porch. People on the neighboring properties whispered about the Darrow family with a circle of words drawn around them. When Mavis carried loaves to the quarter houses, when she slipped medicine brewed from willow bark under a pallet for a woman whose belly clenched like a fist, she heard how the whispers braided. How the Darrow tree had folded its branches back upon itself too many times. How cousin Saul's mother had also been his father's sister, slant-tongued and dead by a fever no doctor would name. How Phineas had been born with a soft place at the back of his skull that never quite closed, how the cemetery at St. Clement's had more Darrow stones than wildflowers. In these tellings, the family's elegant table grew in Mavis's mind into an altar where blood and bread were bound by appetite. If there were cannibals in that county, people said, they would pray like Darrows and bless themselves after. Mavis treated talk like water in a cracked jug, useful, but you pardon the drips. She did not believe in monsters besides the ones who wore linen. But she believed in hunger, especially the type that did not end even when a man loosened his belt. She saw it in Garrett Darrow's eyes when he watched the boys hoeing, the way his gaze searched their backs as if for a cut of meat, the way he asked about the weight of a newborn in pounds instead of joy. She saw it in old Miss Geneva's habit of counting ribs like rosary beads. She saw it in Phineas, who slept too late and woke in a rage, then pressed his lips to Peaches as though Peaches were a test. Her secret literacy was born of this hunger and shaped against it. She wrote sometimes, with a nail dipped in soot, in a ledger that wasn't a ledger at all, a plank she had planed smooth and hidden beneath the hearthstone. Not full words, not yet, but the bones of them, C for corn, R for river, D for Darrow, and below the letters, marks like river signs, the bend where a snake favored the reeds, the eddy where a lost skiff had lodged. She drew the smokehouse lock and the smokehouse keyhole and the way the tumblers sat like teeth. She drew the pattern of Mr. Darrow's steps when he brought in the butchered shoulders, the extra weight he carried the day after the boys sickened, the quiet that fell after the pig's squeals stopped too soon. People might call that kind of drawing suspicion. Mavis called it knowing how to be alive tomorrow. On an afternoon when the sky was the color of pewter and the horizon bruised, Mavis was sent with a spool of thread to old Miss Geneva. The old woman kept rooms that were too dark for eyes meant to last. Geneva sat in a rocker peering at a book without pages, its leather binding gnawed long ago. She liked to pretend the stories were still inside. She ran the thread through her fingers as if it could stitch her into a different life. "Girl," Geneva said, which meant Mavis, which meant no one at all, "do you know the recipe for preserving meat in this heat?" "Salt, ma'am," Mavis answered. "Smoke. Vinegar if you got to travel it. Pack it tight and keep the flies from finding it. And when salt fails." Geneva crooned, leaning forward so the pearls of her spine showed through her dress. "When salt has become a liar. Then you eat it quick," Mavis said, steady as her pulse. "Or you thank the Lord for what little you have left." "Oh, my dear," Geneva murmured, smiling so her gums flashed like secret letters. "We Darrows do not thank the Lord for smallness." She released Mavis with a light flick of fingers, the same gesture one might use to shoo a fly from milk skin. Mavis stepped out into the hall, where Cousin Saul stood as if he had bloomed there from the wainscoting, tall, with a pallor that belonged to muslin more than flesh. He carried the hymn book he always carried, he spoke in the unctuous tone of a man who has practiced empathy in a mirror. "Sister Geneva wears you out with her riddles," he said, arranging the book under his arm as if cradling a child. "May the Lord make light your burdens." "Thank you, sir," Mavis murmured, and moved to pass. The smell of him was a clean, sour thing, like soap on a cloth used too many days. He stepped just a little to the side. "You are a clever one," he said. "I see it in your hands. Sharp hands. A pity decks aren't built by hands like yours." "Decks?" "Of ships," he said. "Of churches." His mouth smiled without his eyes. "Of bodies." Mavis lowered her gaze, as the shape of her life required. But inside she rolled that word around like a stone that might strike. "Bodies," he had said, and in the way he said it she heard the kitchen clock stop. That night she waited until the house had sagged into sleep, then slipped barefoot across the back porch. She worked the corncrib padlock with the nail she kept braided in her hair. She had no business there, she had miles of business there, she took a lantern but didn't light it. She navigated by shape and patience. The wooden bins breathed the dry breath of cobs. The sack mouths yawned. At the back, behind seed corn and a crate of choked gourds, she found a barrel she did not know. It had Darrow stamped into the hoop as if the hoop were a forehead. The bung had been sealed not with wax but with some other resin that shone like a black puddle after storm. She pressed her ear to the wood. The sound inside was not sound so much as an absence of it. Like a mouth held just this side of scream. She was about to step away when she heard Phineas on the porch, vomiting again. He was a man who could not keep down his own meals for long, yet who always found room for cruelty. She slid between bins. She became a shadow that had learned her name. Phineas cursed, spat, and laughed that mean laugh he had, thin, brittle, unearned. He dragged his feet back toward the house. After he'd gone, Mavis left the corncrib and crept onto the smokehouse. A chorus of moths fretted around the lintel. She had oiled the hinge 2 nights before, no squeak, and she blessed herself in a language no one had taught her. Even in that heat, the smokehouse felt like a stone cellar. The air held its temperature the way a grudge holds its justification. Hams hung like pale bells. Strings of links swayed a little, as if they had been disturbed. She stood perfectly still. Listened. The river, the wind, the distant cough of a mule. And underneath that, a soft, damp tapping, intermittent like a slow heartbeat. Mavis followed the sound with her eyes before she moved her feet. She learned that trick from watching cats. Down low, by the barrels where brine sits in shadows, something was insisting on a small existence. Not a rat. Rats gossip. This was a different kind of knock. She crouched and slid the spokeshave along the plank edge to feel the grain with the blade. A breath exhaled from between the boards, a cool breath that smelled like cold stone and something else, something faintly sweet, like the breath of an infant after milk. She did not recoil. She let the smell write itself on her mind, then she slid the blade back and stood. She did not light the lantern. She did not open any barrels. She shut the smokehouse door gently and left the field of moths to their fretwork. Knowing is not the same as telling. She told no one. She went to the quarter houses and boiled willow bark for the boys whose guts felt wrung by evil hands. She salted fish until her fingers whitened. She wrote on her hidden plank the shape of the smokehouse boards and a new sign for smell, which she drew as a child's mouth with a halo over it. The next Sunday, Cousin Saul preached in the room they used for preaching, and the Darrows sang the way people sing when notes are a cage they climb into for the pleasure of pretending they cannot leave. He spoke of purity, which made Mistress Eliza go pink like a struck flower. He spoke of covenant, which made old Geneva smile without interfering with her teeth. Phineas fidgeted and licked honey from his thumb like a boy. Mavis stood at the back, holding the basket of bread. She listened because you listen when someone brings a knife into a room and calls it a psalm. We must be made clean, Saul said. The Lord's work is an anatomy. He demands we separate sickness from flesh. His eyes flitted to the corridor door that led outside like a vein to the heart. He demands we cull to preserve. Mavis watched the way his jaw tightened when he said cull. She watched Garrett's hand on the pew back flex as if measuring thickness, wood, bone, neck. She realized then that their talk of purity had nothing to do with water. That night a storm gathered. The first clap of thunder broke the air like a pane smashed by a thrown Bible. In that loudness, people lose track of small sounds. Mavis had learned to love thunder as a cover. She used its voice to cloak her own quieter industry. She went to the toolshed, took the file, and worried a key out of a spare iron blank she had hidden in the lathe shavings. Each stroke was a scripture she wrote with her body. I will not be eaten by their story. I will not be the table. She made the key not for the smokehouse but for the root cellar door beneath the main pantry, a door the Darrows kept locked as though dirt might steal. She had watched the lock since winter. It liked to stick on damp days. It liked to be convinced. She had almost convinced it twice. That night, with the storm walking the ridgeline and the house drunk on fear, she convinced it fully. The door sighed open as though the house had been holding its breath against this very moment. She shut it behind her. The lantern kissed a low flame into the dark and the dark allowed it. The first thing she noticed was the order. Darrows curated their world, they curated their cellars too. Jars lined the shelves in scholar's neatness, peaches, okra, beans, and on the floor lay sacks like sleeping children, rice, corn, flour. A different set of shelves held bottles with labels in an even hand. Tincture of gentian. Laudanum. A jar that read, preservatives. She touched the jar. The glass was old, bubbled. Inside lay salt white as a rich woman's palm and a darker powder like ash. Mavis backed away, lamp steady. On the far wall, the light discovered a low door within a door, an inner panel fitted so precisely it almost wasn't there. No lock. That kind of confidence was its own sort of warning. She opened it. A tunnel sloped away as if dug by a creature that loved straight lines. It smelled like cold bones and something once living convinced to be still. Mavis lowered the lantern and looked down into the angle of the earth. She had the compass in her apron pocket, she had the Spokeshave blade. She slid the compass lid with her thumb until north was a thin, humming thought. The tunnel ran toward the river. Mavis closed the panel and the door and returned the key to the toolshed. She left everything as she had found it, which is to say she left everything pretending it had never been found. The next days made up a week that felt like one long hour. Work rose and fell and rose. Mr. Darrow argued with a man at the gate who wore a hat with a city brim. Mistress Eliza emptied her pearls into a dish and counted them like goats. Phineas tracked Mud into rooms where Mud had never been permitted to think about existing. Cousin Saul spent hours by the river and came back damp and sanctified. Old Geneva began to hum a tune that made Mavis's teeth ache. Mavis sewed, chopped, fetched, ladled, raked, and in every movement she collected more of the story the house told when it believed no one was listening. On Friday, Garrett announced a harvest supper for the house and the hands. "We must mark the Lord's mercy," he said, and everyone knew he meant, "We must stage what mercy looks like on a plate." Mavis baked bread that rose like small sunrises. She roasted squash until its flesh surrendered into sweetness. She balanced the spicing of the pot liquor as if it were a stubborn scale. She salted the pork modestly. She doled out a separate portion of greens for the quarter children with less fat in it because she would not be the instrument of their sickening. The Darrows ate as if each swallow were a vote. They smiled at one another as if affirming a rumor. Mavis watched their hands. Cousin Saul spoke grace with his eyes closed and his lips damp. She could swear she heard the river answer back, not amen, but a sound like a rope pulled through wet pulleys. There were no signs of sickness that night. There were only signs of a ritual that hadn't yet been named. Near midnight, while the supper's ghosts were still heavy in the air, a woman from the quarters banged on the kitchen door. She held a child who burned without flame. The child's breath rasped like a saw through knotted wood. Mavis took them into the scullery and wiped the child's body with cool vinegar and water. She made a tea of willow bark and horehound and, because she had once seen it in a city woman's prescription, a shaving of the gentian root from the cellar jar. The child slept. The mother wept into her own skirt quietly, an economy of grief. Mavis told her to stay until dawn. When dawn came, Mr. Darrow found them and sent the woman back to the quarters with a glance that counted the cost of her delay. He did not accuse Mavis of theft because nothing he could name was missing. He asked her to bring the gentlemen their coffee. The gentlemen were himself, Cousin Saul, and a man with a city hat, who turned out to be a doctor. The doctor had the sort of hands that believed in themselves. He also had a little case that clicked. Mavis poured coffee, balanced cups on a tray like a shorthand for defiance, and listened. "Not typhoid," the doctor was saying. "Not exactly flux. A wasting of some acquisition. The bodies show a profound depletion." "From what?" Garrett demanded. The doctor glanced at the breakfast ham. "From themselves." Cousin Saul smiled. "Ah," he said. "A humoral imbalance. Imbalance must be answered by balance. What blasphemies men will name science." The doctor did not meet Saul's eyes. "I recommend a culling of diet. No fatty meats, no new corn, no." Garrett interrupted with the impatience of a man who believed words owed him obedience. "We'll do what must be done," he said, and though it sounded like agreement it wasn't. That afternoon, the doctor left with a bag of coins and a face like a man who had glimpsed a boundary he could not chart. Cousin Saul went to the river again. Mavis worked. In the blue hour between day and night, she crept again into the pantry and down to the cellar, lantern unlit, moving by memory. She opened the inner panel and breathed the tunnel's breath all the way to her bones. She did not go in yet. She closed it and withdrew. Her time had not arrived, but it had sent a letter. Some letters, you go to them. Some letters, you let them come. It came on a Sunday that wore a weekday's face. The Darrows dressed for church but didn't go. They gathered in the back gallery, which faced the river like a stage faces an audience. The quarter hands were made to stand in the house yard. The river ran hard, as if urged. The sky looked like a metal pail turned over and beaten. Cousin Saul set a candle on a side table and lit it though the hour had no need of it. He said, "Scripture," in a voice that volunteered itself for a crown, and Garrett said, "Family," in a voice that tightened the nettle string. Mavis held a pitcher of water that was almost too heavy for that day. She stood under the gallery eaves, close enough to hear everything as if it were being whispered directly into her ear. Phineas brought out a long bundle covered with a sheet. He handled it with an odd combination of reverence and boredom, like a man holding a snake he'd been assured was not venomous. He placed it on the table. Garrett drew back the sheet with a flourish that made Mistress Eliza's pearls sigh. Beneath lay not a body but a board with straps. A stretcher's mean cousin. Cousin Saul raised his hands. "The Lord's work," he announced. "A cleansing. We must keep what is ours from rot. The body," he tapped his own chest, "as sacrament. There are times when fear tells you to flee and times when fear holds your ankles like a mother keeps her child from stepping into a fire." Mavis stood rooted, full of roots. Old Geneva began that humming again, a tune whose rhythm matched the beat of a saw pulled through something that did not want to be divided. They brought forth from the quarters an old man named Abel who had worked the river canoes before the Darrows were born. He was small now, a bundle of tough twigs with eyes like deep wells. He had been sick with the wasting since the storm. He had been given the willow tea and had not improved. Garrett talked about burden and mercy in a tone that admired itself. Phineas buckled Abel to the board and Abel did not fight, not because he agreed but because he knew something Mavis had only just learned: there are battles whose victory is to be witnessed, not won. Mavis set down the water pitcher. Her hands did not shake. She had learned the value of stillness in a world that preferred her busy. She watched Cousin Saul pick up the little case that clicked. He opened it and took out instruments that glinted as if they had stories. He muttered prayers that sounded like recipes. Mavis could not move without everything changing. Sometimes you must not change something until you are also ready to change everything. Cousin Saul made a small incision over Abel's collarbone. It was precise, practiced. He murmured about letting sickness out. He placed a cup against the wound to draw. He told the family to watch the color of the blood, to see how dark meant poison, to see how pale meant promise. He did not notice the way Garrett's lips parted, not at the blood, but at his own power. He did not notice the way Phineas leaned forward with a curiosity too intimate for medicine. He did not notice old Geneva's fingers twitch as if playing an invisible keyboard. Mavis saw everything. She saw the slight dimple in Cousin Saul's temple where a vein pulsed too quickly. She saw the ants crawling in a line along the gallery rail, carrying a crumb that would feed 100 of them. She saw the river change color just a shade where the light shifted. She saw the way Abel's eyes drifted not to the faces above him but to the house door, as if he were saying goodbye to walls. She did not cry. She stored. Abel lived through the ritual. He was carried back to the quarters with a bandage like a proud scar. The Darrows congratulated themselves. The candle guttered though the day was bright. Mavis cleaned the instruments, because she was told to and because the story of metal is told by those who clean it. She counted, quietly, the cuts the Darrows had found themselves capable of making. She said the numbers inside her like a spell. She did not go to the cellar that night. She went to the river and watched it right. In the days that followed, Abel improved a little and then did not. 3 children sickened. One of them, a girl named Liddy whose laugh walked ahead of her in summer, died at dawn on a Wednesday that did not deserve to exist. Mavis washed her small body with hands that had spent all their tenderness and still found more. She braided Liddy's hair because the dead should look like themselves to the living. She wrapped Liddy in the only white sheet she could steal without notice and carried her to the willow the river loved. She did not weep where the Darrows could see. She wept where the water could make something of it besides a story. That evening, Mavis made a decision whose sound was less thunder than hinge. She went to the pantry in the cellar and opened the inner panel. She took the lantern this time and let it speak a little fire. She stepped into the tunnel and counted her breaths as if each were a bead on a rosary that led not to heaven but to the other side of terror. The tunnel was tall enough to walk and narrow enough to feel made for one. The air was dry the way books like to be. She moved slowly, testing the ground with the heel of her hand before trusting it with her foot. At intervals the earth's ceiling arched lower, where root fingers broke through like questions. She touched them as she passed, giving them the names of the children who had sickened, so the land would know. After a distance that could have been 50 yards or a lifetime, the tunnel opened into a room that had once been a cave. Someone had lined it with plank shelves and adorned them with jars and bottles and things wrapped in oilcloth. In one corner stood a rough table with straps. The straps were darkened with a history Mavis refused to let into her body. She lifted the lantern. On the far shelf stood 3 large crocks labeled in Cousin Saul's even hand, preserves. Mavis set the lantern on the table because her hands wanted to be free when they learned what they were about to learn. She unsealed a crock. She kept her breath small. Inside lay meat floating in fat, layered like a book that had lost the courage of words. Not pork. Not beef. Something with a sweetness in the smell that did not belong to anything you should eat. Something so soft it wanted to come apart at the thought of a spoon. She sealed it again. She stood in the dark and let the lantern blaze and then steady. She imagined the shape her face made in that moment and hoped never to see it on another. She turned to the table and saw a ledger, at last a real one, its pages neat. She read a few lines with the half-reading she had made for herself in scattered kitchens. Dates. Names. Weights. The line for Liddy was empty because Liddy had died too new. Mavis did not scream. She did not even exhale in a way that told on her. She left the room as she had found it, took the lantern, closed the panel, locked the door, returned the key, washed her hands until skin complained, and baked bread at dawn so that the house woke to the smell of something human beings have used to remind themselves it is worth being won. After that, she began to map not only the house but the people. She watched Cousin Saul's schedule and saw how it made a net. She watched how Phineas kept time with his stomach and mistook appetite for destiny. She watched how Mistress Eliza measured cleanliness with the same intensity other women measured love. Mavis measured the space between Garrett's anger and his boredom. She measured the places where old Geneva's mind left and returned with luggage. She wrote these measurements in her hidden plank with letters that had become words: cellar tunnel north, preserves human, ledger names, river exit probable. She began to coordinate small resistances. A warning to the mothers about which pots to eat from. A new way of salting the ham for the quarters that kept it from tasting like mercy offered by a snake. A whisper to the carpenter in the next county, the one whose sister listened to anyone as if he were worth the trouble. She sent him a note, a tiny folded thing hidden in the bottom of a flour measure, that said only, "Watch Darrow River at night. Bring rope and strong men who believe in boats." Every choice grew a consequence, like a root grows a hairline that eventually cracks stone. Mavis knew this. It did not dissuade her. When she stood in the kitchen stirring a pot, she pictured herself as a spindle twisting raw fiber into a thread that could pull a building down. One night the house threw a party for itself. The Darrows invited neighbors who pretended not to fear their invitations. Fiddle music sawed the air into strips, ladies glittered like frost in places where frost had never been invited. Mavis placed biscuits in baskets and intercepted a child's hand with a smile before it reached the wrong tray. Cousin Saul held court near the punch and spoke of chastity with a mouth stained red. Phineas danced poorly with a woman who looked at him as if he were a room she might escape by pretending it was small. Mavis used the noise to slip to the pantry and down into the cellar, not to visit the tunnel this time, but to move the jar labeled preservatives. She replaced its contents with plain salt. She had spent weeks making sure no one else used the jar. She wanted the moment quiet. She wanted to force Cousin Saul to reach for his certainty and bring up a handful of nothing. It was a small thing. It was a lever. She had just set the jar back when she heard steps in the pantry above, heavy and two at once. She snuffed the lantern with her fingers, took the sting, and flattened into shadow. The cellar door opened and the black shape of Phineas tumbled down 3 steps, laughter snarling with anger. "You bring me down here like a dog," he shouted up the steps to a softer set of feet. "Then you act like the dog is the cause." Mistress Eliza's voice slid down the stairs like a ribbon cut by a knife. "Lower your voice, Phineas." "I will not. This house stinks of rot." "The doctor said." "The doctor said many things." "He is gone." She descended, and in the dark Mavis could feel the weight of her pearls like a chain sawed into tiny links. "Your father will hear you." "Let him," Phineas sneered. "Let him hear me. I am tired of being hungry for what is promised to me." The cellar held its breath. Mavis did not. She had learned to breathe when a room forgot how. Eliza moved close enough that Mavis could smell her perfume, orange blossom and the ghost of something medicinal. "You will not speak of promises in that tone," Eliza said. "You will not speak of the little pause was the sound of a woman stepping around a mirror. "The sacrifices as if they were dirty." Phineas laughed, and the laugh belonged to a boy who had put a frog on a windowsill and watched it dry. "We are dirty," he said. "We have always been dirty. We wash and call ourselves clean. We eat and call it sacrament." Eliza slapped him then, a clean sound like a teacup cracked. Phineas stumbled backward into a shelf. Jars clinked. One fell and broke. The smell that rose was peaches and vinegar and a sweetness that made Mavis's teeth want to crawl out of her head. Eliza inhaled, and in that one breath Mavis learned everything she needed to know about the woman's soul. Eliza did not recoil. She did not gag. She stood taller. "Pick that up," she said. Phineas knelt in the broken light. "I am tired of crumbs," he whispered. "Then learn to bake," Eliza replied, and went up the stairs, leaving a piece of herself behind like a button. When they were gone, Mavis gathered her unstung lantern and returned to the kitchen, where she folded biscuits for people who would never earn a biscuit. She moved like a quiet event. She kept her rage warm the way one keeps bread proofing, covered, unseen, expanding. The night of the river came 3 days later, when the moon had been shaved to a coin and traded to someone unworthy. Mavis took a bar of soap and carved the letters of a word she had not yet written with ink. Now. She tucked the soap in her apron. She had braided her hair close to her head. She had bound her breasts with a strip of cloth so she could run without the body telling on itself. She had a small sack with a coil of rope and a stub of tallow and the compass that had waited like a patient creature in her pocket for weeks. She set the kitchen clock back by 10 minutes so the house would be late to catch her. She went to the cellar, through the panel, down the tunnel, lantern dark. She counted steps. Her feet learned the pitch of the earth. She felt the river draw the air through the tunnel like lungs drawing breath. She reached the cave room and did not let the lantern look at the crocks. She went to the far side where the wall sloped and became earth again, and there she found a cunning door of wattle and plaster, a gate for river things. She pressed her ear. The river answered with its old voice, "Come if you dare, and if you do not, I will come for you anyway." She pressed. The door gave with a reluctance that felt personal. Night wind kissed her face with a taste like iron and figs, the first taste of the first line of the book she had been writing by living long enough. She slipped out onto a bank pocked with the feet of men who had used it for years. She crouched, listening. Downstream, a boat creaked. Upstream, another replied. On the far bank, the cough of a man trying not to cough said, "We came." Mavis raised her hand the way you do when you finally say your own name out loud. She was about to whistle the signal she had taught to the boys who could mimic bird calls with their teeth when a voice behind her said very softly, "I wondered which of you would find the door." It was Cousin Saul. He did not hold a lantern. He held the little case that clicked. He stepped forward, and the moon made of his face a map drawn by liars. I knew it would be you, he said gently, as if waking a child. You have a craftsman's hands. Come away from there, Mavis. The river is not for you. She did not turn. She did not run. She had learned, from wood and iron, that sometimes the strongest shape is a still one. She said, "Step back." He laughed with real delight. "Little scholar," he murmured. "Little engineer. Who taught you to read? What demon wrote you a primer?" "I taught me," she said. "And hunger wrote the rest." He moved closer. The click case clicked. "Do you know what the body is?" he asked, reverent. "It is a church. It is a nation. It is a house. It must be purified." Mavis slipped the soap from her pocket, the bar carved with now, and crushed it in her fist until it squealed. The smell of lye rose between them like a wall. She threw the crumbled soap dust into his eyes. Saul screamed without sound, a fish on the bank. He dropped the case. He grabbed at his face, blinded by the bite. Mavis did not wait to be thanked by fate. She sprinted down the bank, whistled the call that meant rope ready, and felt the night answer with oars biting water. Behind her, feet thundered, a household waking to the sound of its own sins being baptized. Garrett bellowed. Phineas stumbled. Eliza called for fire as if fire had ever been a gentleman. Old Geneva began to sing, and the song made the river throw up its hands. Mavis leapt into the boat as it kissed the mud, hands grabbing hands, bodies folding around accommodations made for fear and courage. The rope hissed as someone cut it loose. The river took them like a mother finally given the child that had been kept from her. And then a shot cracked, the sort of sound that never belongs to any music, in the lantern on the far bank. Someone had lit one, spun out and vanished into the water. The boat lurched. A man next to Mavis gasped and went limp. She gripped the gunwale and looked back. On the bank stood Garrett Darrow with a pistol held clean as a judgment, Cousin Saul wiping his burning eyes with the sleeve of his white shirt until it wasn't white anymore, Phineas laughing that frog-drying laugh, Mistress Eliza tall as her pearls, old Geneva with her hands raised like a choir mistress who has finally chosen the hymn. "Bring her back," Garrett said to the river, as if the river worked for him. The oars dug in. The boat leapt. The river spoke a new language made of speed. A second shot tore the air and Mavis felt it cut a seam in the night right beside her ear. She turned her face toward the dark ahead and did not pray. She counted. 1 bend. 2. The third would split open like a mouth and show them either a path to the marsh or a snarl of fallen trees, and in that breath between the second and the third, a shape rose from the water ahead, another boat, squared to block them, carrying a lantern that revealed the man in it. Phineas, grinning, having raced along the towpath, his boat pole braced like a spear, his hunger larger than the river itself, his voice carrying over the water in a high, delighted cry. Welcome home. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. Welcome home. The words struck the river like a thrown plate. The lantern on Phineas's thwart carved him out of the dark, chin tipped up, pretty mouth curdled with delight, pole wedged to brace the current. The river narrowed here into a throat where boats went hoarse. Mavis felt the men around her tense like coiled rope. Oars feathered. Breath shortened. Sound simplified into 3 dominoes: water, wood, will. Mavis, a man to her left whispered, the carpenter's sister's cousin, called Buck by everyone and Nathaniel by a mother who still lived to say it, hold low. She pressed down, hand on the gunwale, eyes square on the problem like a craftsman measuring twice. The boat that blocked them was wide enough to make a lie of passing. The bank grasses hissed a warning. Behind them, Garrett shouted orders in a voice that believed wood and water took instruction. In front, Phineas laughed again, high as a kettle's first cry. The river taught Mavis something then, what she had always suspected while scrubbing floors and shells in grief: some things yield only to being made to want to. She touched the oarman's elbow. Angelus, she said. Not to him. To the bank. We'll ground, Buck hissed. Good, Mavis said. Let it bite. Then we jump. The men trusted her because she had asked for them months ago with a note hidden under flour and because their own sisters had told them to. The ladder dug hard to starboard, the hull slid. The bank's mud kissed them like a relative forced to act happy. The boat scraped to a stop an arm's length short of Phineas's pole. Now, she called. They moved as if the word itself pushed them, 3 into the shallows, 2 vaulting past Phineas's lantern, 1, Buck, springing like a man catching a falling child. Mavis used the stuck hull for what it was, a plank someone had accidentally built for her. She ran the length of its spine and flew, a small woman practicing the physics of refusal. She caught the lip of Phineas's boat with both hands. He jabbed with the pole. She rolled her shoulders so it bit mud instead of bone. The pole skittered and slid from his hands into the river, where it was immediately employed by the current for a different purpose, carried away like a lie leaving a room. Phineas shrieked, not fear yet, but the harm done to his imagined invulnerability. He grabbed for her hair. She had braided it flat to her skull for this night and wrapped it in cloth. His hands caught only indifference. She hauled herself over the gunwale, legs scissoring for leverage, and landed with one knee on the thwart and one foot on Phineas's instep. He howled. She did not look at his face. She found the painter line at the bow with her left hand, saw in her mind a drawing she had made on a plank under a hearth, a knot described in quiet, and set that knot, quick and sure. "Buck," she shouted. "On it." He heaved the rope she had knotted. Men on the bank pulled. Phineas's boat slewed out of the channel where it could block and into the reeds where boats go to learn humility. Phineas flailed, slipped, and went into the marsh to his thighs. The mud hugged him the way an old vice hugs memory. He screamed for help. Garrett's answer was a bullet, not aimed to save his son so much as to punish the knight for not obeying. The shot whipped the air again. Splinters leapt from a gunwale somewhere. Frogs went silent the way a congregation goes quiet when the preacher says the part that requires quiet. "Row!" Mavis shouted. The men shoved their boat free, oars bit, water opened. They slid past Phineas swearing, Cousin Saul cursing his stung eyes, Eliza calling in a tone that would have made obedient furniture run to her, Geneva singing a tune whose words were bones. "Follow!" Garrett roared. "Let him," Mavis said to Buck. "Let the river make him honest." They did not row straight to safety. Safety does not exist as a direction you can plot with a compass. They rowed to the bend where the water knew her name. The men in the second boat fell in behind. A third shape slid from under the willow's shadow, another crew the carpenter's sister had haunted and harried into truth. Garrett's boat splashed into the channel with fury for oars. Phineas slogged free of the marsh and fell into a skiff as if born to it. Cousin Saul, rinsed by the river and desire, launched, blind but aiming by hunger alone. The chase wrote itself across the next mile like a paragraph too fast to punctuate. Mavis counted not distance but chances. She read the river's grammar the way she had read molasses labels. Here the current made a comma, there the driftwood made a dash. Low branches offered ellipses. She told the men when to hush and when to heave. She kept her body low when bullets argued with air and high when they needed her eyes. At the second bend the river split its sentence with a semicolon, a narrow cut that a child or a woman would notice because it looked like a choice. "Left," Mavis said, and the oars obeyed her. The boat slid into the cut, shallow and thorny. They lay flat while willow fingers scratched blessings onto their backs. Garrett's boat thundered past the opening, hauling too much certainty to see it. Phineas's skiff, lighter and meaner, caught the hint and shouldered in after them, but slower, because Phineas liked the sound of his own name more than the sound of a river's advice. They came out into a backwater braided with cattails. Moon shreds lay on the surface like torn letters. Mavis signaled, 2 fingers to the men in the other boats. They split as well, one sliding like an eel toward the marsh flats, the other easing into an inlet that smelled of turtle and old iron. Mavis steered them up against a bank where cypress knees stood like a congregation too tired to sit. "Hide," she breathed. "Where?" Buck asked, because he was a man accustomed to wood that stays where you put it. "Under," Mavis said, and slipped from the boat into water that felt like a deep thought held too long. She tipped the hole gently, flooding it an inch, then two, until it settled in the surface weeds like a sleeping animal. Men held breath in gunnels. Reeds accepted them with the grace of a crowded table-making room. Phineas pulled into the backwater mouth without a pole. He had found another stick and called it Hope. He slashed at the reeds angrily. "I'll find you," he sang. "I'll make you dinner." His voice cracked on dinner like a boy's excuses. The boat slid by, close enough that Mavis could see the shape of his ankle bones through wet cloth. The pale wheels on his wrists were bracelets of his own making had rubbed when he played at power in dark rooms. He moved on. He did not know how to listen. Cousin Saul entered the backwater slower, mouth closed, eyes slitted against the sting that still worked him. He waited. He let the night talk. He heard more than Phineas, he always had. He turned his head like a heron measuring the lives it could end. Mavis did not breathe the way lungs prefer. She breathed like a violin string takes air, through wood, through patience. Saul's boat drifted within an oar's length of them, bow cutting a little V of scum. He sniffed. He smiled. "Clever," he murmured. "Clever." He reached into his little clicking case by touch. He did not pull a pistol. He pulled a thin knife that looked like a question mark convinced to become a period. He poised it above the water, not to strike a person but to disturb truth itself. "I will draw circles," he whispered to no one into the night. "And where the water breaks wrong, there you will be." Mavis felt his intention like a draft in a room with all windows closed. She still had the bar of soap crumbs on her palms, their sting now part of her. She slid her hand under the water and brushed the hole gently, nudging a slow exhale of bubbles from the place where the plank met the rib. The bubbles wandered, unhurried, a cousin to frogs. Saul's knife traced arcs, caught ripples. He did not find the bubbles. He frowned. The river made a small smug sound. Saul drifted on. When they were alone with the frogs again, Mavis whispered, "We go back." Buck's head jerked. "Back?" "To the house," she said. The words tasted like a nail she had decided would be pulled today. "You can run 3 nights and they will still hunt. Or you can uproot the tree and it stops offering shade to your enemies." He studied her in the dark as if he were learning a face he would tell his children about. "You aiming to die?" "I am aiming to live in a way that does not require their permission." "What's the plan?" "Their purity is a tunnel," she said. "We flood it." They eased from the reeds when the backwater forgot them, slid into the cut and let it spit them back into the main vein. Garrett's boat voices echoed far ahead, angry and increasingly disparate. Men get lost when anger becomes its own map. Mavis set them by the compass in her pocket and the older compass inside her bones. They took the long way, hugging shade, letting the current carry them where it wanted carrying to matter. By the time the house hulked against the sky, a black shape threaded with window light, the Darrow boats were empty along the lower bank, tied in a hurry and unguarded, like a threat a man had interrupted to admire himself. They did not land at the boats. They slipped instead to the tunnel slit where she had slipped before. Mavis felt the wattle door with hands that remembered its objection. "Hold here," she breathed. "Quiet." She slid into the slit and down. The lantern was a memory she didn't need. The tunnel held enough night for any plan. In the cave room she paused only long enough to lay her palm on the crocks labeled preserves as one lays a hand on the head of an unrepentant sinner at a river baptism. She did not unseal them. She walked to the far corner where a barrel Mavis had not noticed the first time sat with its bung like a mouth. Above it, a small channel cut into the wall caught seepage from the river and let it into a cistern. Someone had built safety into their secret and never considered that safety can be repurposed. She pulled the bung. Water began to pour. It did not rush, it committed. The barrel filled and then overflowed. The floor grew slick. The straps on the table darkened with a history none of them had chosen. She found the little trench that led toward the pantry door, a cunning drain meant to keep the room dry, and blocked it with the ledger, which swelled like a corpse given back to wait. The water, denied its expected path, sought another. It found the tunnel. It cheered, softly. Mavis. Buck hissed down the dark. Company. She ran back, feet learning again where not to place themselves, and slipped through the wattle to the bank. On the high gallery, shadows moved, Eliza's tall, Saul's lean, Garrett's bulky authority. Phineas's was missing, he was likely still licking mud from his pride. You go set the quarter people free of fear, Mavis told Buck. Tell them, tonight we choose our names out loud. Tell them, bring what walks, carry what can be carried, leave what you would have never wanted to own. And you, he asked. I am going to make the house speak the truth it has been eating. She took off at a crouch, up the bank, along the hedge. She slid into the kitchen like a rumor. The room smelled of last night's music and the morning's lies. She picked up the kettle slouched on the trivet and poured its water into the washbasin. She took a handful of lye from the sack in the corner and stirred. Nothing that burns a person's face, not tonight. She had used the soap for Saul already, but enough to make the water a persuasion. She soaked rags and laid them on the floor between pantry and back hall as markers of future fire might appreciate. She opened the scullery window she would need open later. From the gallery came a voice, girl. Eliza. Mavis stepped into the doorway as if she had been summoned by her true name. Eliza stood in moon and candle, pearls luminous as if they emitted their own conscience. Where's the boy? The mistress asked, meaning Phineas, meaning an old threat. Where's the old woman from the quarters, the one with the cough? She was in my pantry just now and had the audacity to drink water from our pitcher. In the yard, Mavis said. With her people. Eliza's eyes went thin with arithmetic. Call them back, she said. No, Mavis replied. The word hung in the hallway as though it belonged on every wall and had only been missing because someone had borrowed it without asking. Eliza blinked, not so much startled as insulted. I do not think you heard me. I heard you, Mavis said. I answered. Eliza advanced a step and in doing so stepped into the little lake Mavis had made of lye water. She did not slip, she steadied. She looked down, smelled, and drew back in distaste. Clean this, she said. You are paid in shelter. You are paid in food. I am paid in my own breath, Mavis said. And tonight I keep it. Behind Eliza, cousin Saul's silhouette appeared, one eye swollen, the other bright. Ah, he said softly. The scholar. The artisan. Come to hear a sermon? Mavis smiled without entertainment. I have heard yours, she said. I have come to speak one. Garrett moved into view, jaw blue with beard he had not had time to shave. Enough, he said. The word, said by him, broke like cheap china. Tell the hands to clear the yard. We have rain coming. You have river coming, Mavis said. They did not understand until the pantry door sighed, the sound of wood relinquishing a long privilege, and a draught rolled out from the cellar, wet and cold and certain as grammar. Eliza turned first. She understood houses because she wore one as a skin. Saul turned, slow, mouth open, not in fear, but in rapture. He loved a spectacle too much to love anything else. Garrett swore and reached for a pistol that would be less useful than a towel. Water lipped over the pantry threshold as if tasting. It gathered itself. It came. Not in a roar, not yet, but in a deliberate march, the way debt comes due. It climbed the kitchen planks in a bright shoal. It found the lye rags and argued with them into a small, slick riot. It topped the scullery sill and looked for the window. It found it open because Mavis had offered it that path the way one offers a horse a gate. Mavis, Eliza said, calm and terrible. What have you done? I have invited something cleaner than you, Mavis said. Garrett lunged. Men are taught lunging the way boys are taught skipping stones. Mavis stepped sideways into the scullery, light, letting him commit to a direction. He slid on the lye wet and hit the doorframe with a grunt that took the shine off his authority. Saul reached for Mavis as if for a sacrament. She slipped him like a bad memory and drew him bodily into the scullery where the floor now made its own argument. He caught the windowsill to keep from falling and hissed when the lye found old cuts on his hand. Call them. Eliza commanded into the dark yard beyond the gallery. Phineas. Geneva. Call the men. Phineas answered with a staggering appearance in the hall, wild as a dog who had rolled in its own shame. Mud clung to him in the ways love never had. He saw the water and he laughed, not out of humor, but because his body had only two settings, hunger and hysteria. Old Geneva came too, clutching her book without pages. She dipped her fingers in the advancing water as if anointing herself. Outside, in the yard, shouts rose, Buck's voice among them, other men, other women, the unstoppable sound of a people deciding they belong to themselves. The quarter doors opened all at once like a choir's mouths finding the same pitch. Wood groaned as if shifting allegiance. The water reached the stove and hissed at its iron, then clambered over like a pilgrim who had waited long enough. It kissed the pantry door as it passed, then remembered the tunnel, the oldest letter in the evening's sentence, and poured itself into the secret that had tried to stay secret. The house trembled, imperceptibly at first, then like a body bothered by a fever it finally admits. A sound came up from the floor, deep and resentful, the sound of shelves remembering weight. Cousin Saul said, "No," very softly and very lovingly, as if negating a betrayal delivered by a favorite child. "Do not take my church." "Your church?" Mavis asked. "You mean the bodies you polluted into sacrament? Let the river catechize you now." He lunged for the pantry. Mavis did not stop him, she simply gave him what he loved, the path to his ruin. He skidded, grabbed the jam, vanished down the stairs with a splash and a curse in a wet litany. Garrett followed, bellowing orders to water. Phineas, delighted, went last, because he could not bear to miss a theater. "Geneva," Eliza said, turning to the old woman as if to a stable pillar, "go to your room." Geneva smiled a child's wicked smile. "At last the house sings," she said, and began to hum the tune again, the one that made Mavis ache, but now the ache changed key, the hum harmonized with the rushing underfloor. Mavis backed into the yard. People had gathered there, some carrying bundles, some carrying nothing but themselves. Mothers gathered children in clutches like bouquets. Men lifted their chins as if to measure sky. The carpenter's sister stood next to Buck, her arms folded like a door that opens when it wishes. "We ready," she said to Mavis, simple as oak. Mavis nodded. "Spread," she said. "Stay out from under the gallery. When it breaks, it will aim to fall like a decision." From the cellar rose the sounds of men who believed they could reason with a river. "Hold it back!" Garrett shouted. "Plug the Saul, you fool, Phineas, get your hands here. Bring me the ledger." Saul cried, voice thick with rapture and water. "The names, do not let the names." The floor above the pantry bowed, then snapped, then curtsied like a lady who had finally decided to mock her suitors. The pantry door burst, water vomited shelves. Jars tumbled like stars losing their temper. The ledger floated up into the kitchen with a sodden dignity and bobbed there, pages melting into a paste of culpability. Eliza screamed, not the wordless scream of fear, but "my pearls," because what else would a woman who had converted her breath into ornament scream at a flood? She clutched them and stumbled backward as the water invaded the hall. Geneva clapped like a girl at a puppet show. Mavis stepped forward and, with the tongs from the hearth, fished the ledger from the black swirl. It came up heavy, sentences bleeding, lines loosening. She heaved it onto the table where she had rolled pie crusts and dressed rabbits and hidden notes. She looked out over the yard. People looked back. Mavis did not need pulpit or book. She had a body and a voice, and both had been stolen too often to be offered for free again. "These are the names they took into the dark," she said, and her voice carried not because it was loud, but because it had finally stopped asking permission. "These are the weights they made of us. These are the portions they measured in secret to make themselves pure and full." She flipped the cover. Ink sloughed. A few letters held. "We will not be ledgered anymore. We will not be inventory. We will not be recipe." Eliza sloshed forward, pearls bright as lies. She reached for the book with fingers that had known silk more often than bread. Mavis closed the ledger and lifted it high with both hands. She considered fire and rejected it. Fire makes martyrs of charlatans. She considered keeping it and rejected that, too. Keeping is another word for being chained to a memory you did not consent to father. She walked to the scullery window, where water rolled in like a gospel, and she pushed the ledger back into the house's mouth. "Eat it," she told the house. "Eat what you cooked." The ledger sank, then rose, then spun on its own axis, making small storms for dust and crumbs. Below, in the cellar, Saul screamed a wordless sermon. Garrett roared. Phineas laughed until a crash interrupted him, the table in the cave room striking the wall as the current redirected, the crocks jostling free, lids loosening. A smell rose, sick, sweet and final. Even Geneva turned her face then, old eyes closing as if a long prayer had at last gotten its answer, and it was not what anyone had hoped. The back wall of the pantry bulged like a pregnant thing whose time had become command. With a wrenching sigh, the plaster split. River wrote itself into architecture, a quick blue sentence down the wall, a paragraph across the floor. The stove lifted off its bricks and coughed. The gallery posts quivered. A long crack ran up the plaster beside the parlor door and across the portrait of Garrett's father, cleaving the man's painted mouth. Outside, a wind staggered through the kudzu with gossip. "Out!" Eliza shouted at her own family as much as at anyone else. "Out of the house!" Saul burst up from the cellar sluice like an unbaptism, wild-eyed, hair slicked to his scalp like a life finally being combed. He slithered on the wet floor, skidded, found purchase. He saw Mavis and his face went wounded. "You have defiled a sanctuary," he said, panting. "You do not understand the hungers we answer. This is doctrine. This is sickness," Mavis said. "You named it sacrament because you could not stand the word monster." He took a step, hands raised. "I can forgive you." "I did not ask you to," she replied, and let the room decide for her. The gallery beam cracked with a sound like a bone remembering it used to be a tree. The roofline shivered. Garrett stumbled out of the pantry dripping and furious, took one look at the room that had ceased to be his, and found a scapegoat the way a man finds a belt. He leveled the pistol at Mavis. Everyone went still. Even the river paused to watch. Mavis did not raise her hands. She could not make them servants to his theater anymore. She looked at Garrett like a carpenter looks at a faulty joint, not with hatred, but with a knowledge of what must be untaken. "You won't shoot," she said softly, as much to her own trembling body as to him. "You cannot shoot what is already out of your inventory." His finger tightened anyway. The gun exploded, once, twice, until the hammer clicked on emptiness. Smoke curled up from the barrel like doubt. Mavis's ear rang. She was still standing. Beside her, Buck eased up from the yard with something he had saved from a boat, a board long as a verse. He held it sideways, not like a weapon meant to kill but like a lever meant to move something that had forgotten it was movable. He didn't swing. He pressed. He set Garrett's wrist against the jamb the way you set a stubborn nail, and he applied the board's length with the slow pressure carpenters use when they intend repair but sometimes discover justice. Garrett dropped the gun. He roared. He lunged. The floor took him the way the tunnel had taken the jar lids. He went down again, not swallowed completely, but persuaded to kneel by a house that had grown tired of being implicated by his standing. Phineas stumbled and then, hair wild, teeth bared with the wrong sort of joy. He saw Mavis, saw the gathered people, saw his father kneeling, and his face went blank with an animal's effort to reconcile data it cannot afford to understand. He spotted the preserve's crocks bobbing in filth. He reached for one, unscrewed the lid with the ease of practice, and the smell rose like a history rendered into visible steam. He gagged. For the first time, he looked like a boy who did not understand the game he had been taught to crave. "You will be pure," Saul told him savagely, across the slosh and ruin. "You will be saved by discipline." Phineas backed away, knocking into Eliza, who clutched him as if he were a version of herself she might still edit. "We are good," she whispered, to herself, to anyone, to the weather. "We are good." "No," Geneva said, eyes half-lidded, humming. "We are hungry. We have always been hungry." We called it Sunday. Mavis turned to the yard. Choose, she called to her people. Stay in the yard and watch the house eat itself, or come with us to the bank and watch the river make away. They moved, some to gather the few things they'd brought, some to help the old, some to pick up children who would remember this night as one long yes. Buck hovered at Mavis's elbow as if the moment itself had asked for a witness. Where to, he asked. Upstream, then across, she said. There's a cypress hollow a mile and a half where the old ferry used to kiss the shore. We rest there. Then the north road, the long one. Some of us peel into the pine woods and make a camp that knows no names. Some go on where the river grows into another country. And you, he asked. I started a thing here, she said, and the words did not puff themselves up, they lay true. I will finish it. The house will not pretend us into ghosts. The law will come creep and call itself cure. Let it find a crime it must name with its own mouth. As if to accompany her statement with punctuation, a wall inside surrendered. A roar shook the gallery, the beam groaned and folded. The entire back third of the Darrow house sagged and then went, not down at once, but in a series of reluctant collapses like a proud man learning to apologize. Water poured from the gap carrying out jars, boards, a chair that bobbed as if amused to be traveling, lengths of strap like old sentences unspooled. Eliza grabbed Geneva by the arm. We go to the parlor, she said, voice glass sharp. We close the doors. We pray. Geneva laughed openly, the first clean laugh Mavis had ever heard from her. Pray to whom? She asked. To the God that accepts jars? Cousin Saul scrambled for the door. I will fetch the sheriff, he declared, voice finding a new stage. I will fetch the judge, the circuit, the... Do, Mavis said. Bring them. Bring anyone who can stand to smell their own verdict. He fled, feet slapping, a ridiculous creature slick with his own gospel. Garrett staggered to his feet, glared at Mavis with a face that believed in nothing sacred but its own reflection, and spat a promise that his mouth could not afford. You will hang, he said. You will all hang. Mavis tilted her head. Not tonight, she said, and turned her back on him in a move that rewrote her entire life in one sentence. They left then, out the yard, across the wet grass where their shadows braided, down to the lower bank where boats waited like answers written in a hand she'd taught herself to read. The river welcomed them in its cool grammar. She placed elders in the center, children under arms, bundles to ballast. Buck took the stern of one, the carpenter's sister another. Mavis was last to step in and first to look back because we do not become leaders by refusing to count what we have set in motion, we become leaders by looking at it full on and naming it without detesting the mouth that must do the naming. On the gallery, Eliza stood tall in ruin, pearls bright because they knew no other way to be. Phineas leaned on her as if he could return into her unmade. Garrett wiped water and shame from his face and raised his fist, not because it could stop a river but because men like him have practiced that gesture more than any other. Geneva sat on the step like a queen reviewing a parade of consequence. She hummed, the rebuilt song made the hair lift on Mavis's arms. Row, Mavis said. They slid away. The house diminished as if distance carried erasure. Mavis did not let it vanish completely. She kept it a shape in her mind called proof. They reached the old ferry Cypress Hollow at a time of night that has no number. They hid the boats under a mat of brush a boy wove without being asked. His fingers had learned from baskets and made a new use of that learning. They ate what could be eaten without fire, cold hoe cake, a little dried fish, a handful of stolen apples that tasted like someone else's orchard and the same promise. Babies slept. Old men leaned into sleep with the dignity of a long day finally told to sit. The carpenters and boatmen took turns watching the bank where dogs would someday wreathe, where torches might invent themselves. Mavis did not sleep. She sat on a cypress knee and wrote on her plank with a bit of charcoal she kept for marking ovens. We left. We live. Tunnel flooded. Ledger drowned. House cracked. Names ours. She blew the ash from the strokes and felt the letters drying into a headline only she could see. When Buck sat beside her at dawn, she did not hide the plank. He looked at it as if it were a map for a city that does not exist but should. "Where'd you learn all that?" he asked, meaning the letters, meaning the river, meaning the way to step into a night and come out with it wearing your scent. "Reading flour sacks and listening to molecules," she said. "Counting footsteps. Watching women who knew how to make soup from bones and hunger from doctrine. Learning to see." "You'll do more of it," he said, not as praise but as prophecy. A horn sounded downriver in the middle morning. People stiffened. Mavis stood. On the far bank, where the Darrow landing angled into the water, men gathered, the sheriff, the judge with his traveling spectacles, Cousin Saul pointing in declaiming with bandaged hands, Garrett in a clean shirt, Eliza's pearls now restrained into less ostentation. Dogs paced, sneezed, whined at water that refused to carry the right smells. A second horn, lower, answered from upriver, a ferry boat, slow and bulky, carrying 2 bales of law and 1 bale of gossip. "We need to scatter," Buck said. "Yes," Mavis said. "But first we witness." She led them in a long curve through the cypress shallows to a place where reeds would keep them low and the current would keep their sound like a rumor too bored to be believed. They watched. The sheriff stepped into the Darrow yard, picked his way through wet wreckage, and sniffed like a man searching for bacon. He found something else. He retched. The judge covered his nose with a handkerchief fine enough to catch only perfume and not truth. Cousin Saul began to tell his story, the story in which he had been attacked by savages who hated purity, the story in which water had desecrated an altar. He held out his bandaged hands as proof of crucifixion. Garrett added baritone, Phineas coloratura, Eliza a steady contralto of violated order. Geneva wandered the background humming as if score could determine verdict. A deputy with more curiosity than sense ventured into the pantry. He sloshed and squinted. He came back gray. "Judge," he said, "you will want to see the cellar." "I will want no such thing," the judge said honestly, but he went anyway because men like him are paid not to want things and to do them regardless. When he returned, his legs were wet to the knee and his handkerchief had retired. He sat on a fallen beam as if he had aged between the pantry and the yard. He looked at Saul for a long time and then at Garrett for longer. "What," he said heavily, "have you done?" He did not lift it into a question. Garrett spoke of ritual, of bloodletting as doctoring, of purity as a response to disease, of making the house right with itself. The judge's mouth tightened. "You have fed yourselves a cure from the wrong animal," he said without poetry. "And you have written it down. God help you." Saul stepped forward. "You misunderstand," he said. His voice was still soft, still pastorally needed. "We purified. We kept what was ours from rot." The sheriff, who had said almost nothing, bent, picked up from a drift of debris a strap, and ran his thumb over the staining there. He looked out at the river then, and for one thin instant Mavis thought he looked exactly at her. If he did, he made no sign. He turned back to the yard and spit in a way that told duty to fetch its hat. "You'll come," he said to Saul first. "You'll too," to Garrett. "Phineas," he added reluctantly, seeing the boy's soft skull-through skin. "Eliza," he hesitated, found a part of himself that still believed in women as furniture, and amended, "You'll stay." Eliza did not argue. She wrapped her pearls tight enough that they cut and watched the men cuff themselves to a law that had never thought it would be asked to cuff anyone who owned a house this fine. Geneva clapped once, very lightly, and then folded her hands like a tomb closing. "Now," Mavis said to her own people. "Now we leave." They moved as planned, 2 boats up, 1 across, 1 slipping cleverly into the long grass. They did not hurry, hurrying spills. They did not dawdle, dawdling invites memory to become a net. Mavis's boat held the very old woman with the cough, 2 babies whose eyes had learned the new rule, cry when safe, not when hiding, and a boy who had once hunted frogs with Phineas and now kept his face turned towards someplace the horizon did not yet know. They reached the long road by mid-afternoon and became travelers. Travelers are people who convert fear into feet. They learned quickly who would give water for a story and who would trade caution for a loaf. They slept 2 nights in the pines on beds of needles that remembered their bodies, then 2 nights in a barn whose farmer clucked at them without cruelty and brought them eggs, then a night in a schoolhouse whose chalk dust smelled like other people's letters. Each night Mavis wrote on the plank until the plank began to feel heavier with meaning than with wood. Some peeled off toward a swamp maroon that had disguised itself as nothing for a decade. Some hired themselves into a river barge that moved north with a song for a pulley and a stubbornness for a crew. Some went to cousins. Some became their own cousins. They left in halves and in ones until the group that reached the next city was small enough to walk down a single street without reconfiguring the street's understanding of itself. In that city, Mavis found a room above a bakery that smelled like all the dawns of a life she had not yet lived. The baker's wife saw the plank and did not ask to read it. She set tea beside it as if it were a living thing. She looked at Mavis the way you look at a person who has not misrepresented their reasons for breathing. "You need work?" the woman asked. "I need to keep my hands moving," Mavis said. "We can use you," the woman said, and that sentence, offered so simply, felt like the smallest, kindest revolution. Mavis kneaded dough in the mornings and taught letters to children of people who worked nights. She stitched up nets in the afternoons for a riverman who paid people quietly. She went, twice, to a meeting in a church basement where 2 women wrote names on paper with their own handwriting and spoke them out loud for the first time in public. She spoke hers, too, and when the room said it back, she had to sit down because her knees learned something about not bearing weight alone. Yet the story did not end because the house had cracked and the ledger had drowned and men had been led dripping into a law they could not predict. The story did not end because water had been asked to speak and had spoken. We do not conclude because conclusion comforts someone else. We conclude because we are ready to begin again. News came like gulls, slow to trust, quick to scavenge. A month later, in a tavern where sailors taught chairs to wobble, Mavis heard that Garrett Darrow had gotten himself tried on a charge adjusted so that polite mouths could say it: grave desecration, unlawful surgery, something a court could pronounce without having to hold its nose the entire length of the word. Cousin Saul preached in the jail to men who did not want to be preached at and got himself hit for his trouble. Phineas went pale in the dock and paler in the cell, and one night he was found cold on the floor with his tongue bitten, whether by his own fear or by a justice he could not read. Eliza moved to a cousin's house inland and wore black for a year and then pearls again, because pearls do not change their nature without being ground. The Darrow property was auctioned, though the auctioneer spoke quickly over the pantry, the cellar, the tunnel, the reasons. The house that remained lifted its spine by inches and tried to pretend it had not drowned. But water keeps time. Every spring, the river crept into the lower rooms and left a ring around the parlor like a child's height marks, the house growing smaller on paper. And the people who had left, Mavis's people, learned to sleep without listening for a footstep that would claim them, learned to eat without tasting someone else's doctrine between their teeth. They learned new names for days. Monday became bread day, Tuesday sewing, Wednesday a meeting where the old told the true to the young and the young returned it sharper. Thursday became letter day, a chalk slate traveling from hand to hand, each person adding a line, then passing it on, the story moving like a boat up a river that had stopped trying to be anyone's mirror. One evening when the air smelled of yeast and low tide, Buck came up the bakery stairs with a chipped cup and a look that belonged to a man who had walked a long road without letting it rename him. "Package," he said, with the careful casualness of a person who is trying not to alarm what he loves. The package was small, wrapped in paper cut from an account book, tied with string. Inside lay a single page rescued from the ledger and dried between 2 pieces of tin, the ink blurred but legible, a list of weights and measures that had once sought to take the measure of a people and now confessed itself as indictment. At the bottom of the page, someone had written in a different hand, "For the record that will outlast them." Mavis breathed and sat and let herself be tired for the first time since the night the river had learned a new vowel. She traced the rescue letters, saw in the loops and hooks the work of the deputy with too much curiosity and just enough conscience. She did not bless him. She blessed the record. She folded the page into her plank the way a carpenter inlays a precious piece into a tabletop, not to decorate, but to remind a hand reaching for bread what hands are for. Years found them because years always do. Children grew, not into saints or statues but into people good at repairing what wind and water and men break. Mavis taught a girl named Orly to trace letters with a nail and charcoal the way she had once taught herself with soot. She taught a boy named Jacob to listen to doors like violins, to hear which would complain when opened and which would accept an argument. She told the story of the night 8 times and then 10 and then 20, each time leaving nothing out that would turn truth into spectacle, each time leaving everything in that would keep it from becoming a rumor. She told it so often that sometimes she could eat supper without tasting the river, and sometimes she could not. On a day when the bakery's heat felt like an embrace instead of a warning, a woman Mavis didn't know came in with shoulders set in a decision and said, "I heard there is someone here who can teach a body to read while keeping secrets safe." Mavis wiped flour from her hands. "There is," she said. "Sit." The woman sat. She held her hands open the way you present a bowl. "My sister is still on a place upriver," she said. "Not as bad as Darrow, because nothing was. But bad is not a scale I want to weigh. She intends to leave. She needs letters like rope." Mavis nodded. "What's her name?" The woman smiled in a way that made the air join in. "She says it in her sleep like a password," she said. "She says, 'I am Mauve.'" "Good," Mavis said. "We will build her a bridge from here to her and then she can cross it without asking permission." They bent over the plank and chalked a plan. The plan bore the marks of all Mavis's maps, river bends, kitchen doors, a tunnel if needed, a ledger that would be written and then thrown back to whatever mouth offered itself. When they were done, the woman stood and pressed Mavis's hands. "You came through water," she said quietly, not meaning baptism, not meaning drowning, meaning endurance. "We will, too." That night, alone in her room, Mavis lit a candle and set the plank on her lap. She read it from the beginning as if it were a book with covers she had built, and when she reached the part that had almost broken her, the crocks, the ledger, the smell, she did not look away. She let the memory pass through her like a low wave through reeds and left her upright. She thought of Eliza, of pearls, of Phineas's laugh breaking. She thought of Saul in a cell preaching a brick into his own bones. She thought of Garrett looking at a pistol that had emptied itself rather than continue in his hand. She thought of the river and spoke to it out loud for the first time since. "You and I," she said, "we made something cleaner than they deserved." The candle guttered. The plank's letters slept. Mavis lay down. She dreamed, not of houses breaking, but of houses being built, looms of timber rising in a clearing where once someone had measured other people's shadows. In her dream, doors swung on hinges that did not squeal because someone had tended them before they asked, and windows opened because people needed air and because air needed people. In her dream, a table was set, and it groaned only with bread. When morning came, she rose to it. She had a day of dough and nails and children ahead. She had a new plan to ink onto old wood. She had a truth that had decided to belong to her. She went downstairs. She opened the bakery door. She breathed the street, a mix of horse, sea, and hope. She said her name out loud, first to herself and then to the day. The day said it back the way a river says what it has decided to carry. And somewhere upriver, where the Darrow place had learned to be small underwater, a wall sighed and released another section of its secret into the current. A page, this time not ledger, but wallpaper with a childish drawing of a corn cob, peeled itself free and took a small trip toward the marsh. A turtle investigated it, decided it was not food, and pushed it on with a patient claw. This is how purification actually works, Mavis thought later, dusting flour from her palms onto the morning, by refusing poison its ritual, by refusing hunger its altar, by building kitchens that feed a different word. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.